I guess you have seen last night Heute Journal, and you probably came across with a familiar face. Ben was talking for 8 minutes on his perception and evaluation of the present situation. When we discussed the topic of today, what about Ukraine in a changing political environment, we had no idea of Israel. Is it working? No? Okay. We had no idea of Israel, even though at the beginning of this year we had about 6 major lectures on Israel, how to talk about Israel, how to understand Israel. So in a way, the region was prepared to deal with the issue. But last night, I rarely had a German politician or expert talking about the complexity of the situation compared to what Ben Hodges had to say. When we decided, we saw, of course, Ukraine and the decreasing popularity or publicity or the support of the West for the war against Russia, the defense, in a way, of Ukraine. We saw the changes or the problems in America. As you know, the House of Representatives had great difficulties the last few weeks. And then there is an election coming, and people prepare for that election. So the broad discussion in our news were sort of a kind of probably change in support of the Ukraine. And in this context, I thought we need the expertise of General Ben Hodges. You all know, I have dealt with his biography. It's so impressive. I don't want to go into too much details. As you know, he was the commander of USARA, and to reach that position, he had a really very impressive career. But what I probably didn't point out so much, in his career, he had also the role occasionally to mediate between military and civilian, the political era in Washington. And I think only the most sophisticated, the broader mind, are involved in these processes. So to connect this topic, the two fronts probably for the West in Ukraine and Israel, to connect it with the broader geopolitics of this planet, with China, Iran, I think needs a smart mind. And I think that's why we have you here today. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we are now excited.
Lieber Jakob, thank you. It's always good to come to Heidelberg and also to see friends. But I don't believe that my Schwiegermutter would agree with your adjective of sophisticated when you're talking about me. I am grateful for a chance to come back, and several of you were here last time I spoke, and I'm sure you're waiting to say, what happened to your big prediction about Crimea being liberated by the summer, or that I was maybe too optimistic about how Ukraine would be able to win this war. Perhaps I was too optimistic, and it's obvious that they have not yet liberated Crimea. And I think that'll be something that I'll want to address today and figure out what did I miss, but more importantly, what is going to happen in Ukraine. The point that Jakob made in the introduction that I want to build on today, though, is what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Ukraine, what Iran is doing, and what China is doing. All of these are connected. These are not coincidences. These are all connected. And I will want to explain why I think they're connected. And what does that mean for us in the West? What do we do about that to preserve stability and security? And of course, the American political situation is a factor in all of this that also I cannot predict with any certainty, but I think we can talk a little bit about what are the implications and what can we do. Who benefits the most from this war in Israel, from Hamas' attack against Israel and Israel's response inside the Gaza Strip? Who benefits the most from this? Clearly, it's Russia. It's not the Palestinian people. It's not Hamas. Thousands of Hamas fighters are going to be killed. Russia is who benefits the most from this because it is distracting us, our attention and resources away from Ukraine. Exactly what Russia needs right now. Russia is in a lot of trouble. I mean, their logistics is terrible. They are bringing equipment that is older than I am into the fight. That's pretty old. They are released another 100,000 prisoners from jail because they need more bodies for the army. So there is no huge groundswell of support of Russians wanting to get into the army so that they can be sent to Ukraine and get killed. So I think the outlook for Russia is pretty grim, actually. There's no bright horizon, no bright lights on the horizon for the Russian Federation when it comes to their war with Ukraine, unless they can cause the West to lose interest, to stop supporting Ukraine, to be distracted. Now, I don't expect that there is a piece of paper somewhere, a letter from Vladimir Putin to Dear Ayatollah, please attack Israel on 7 October. I don't expect that, of course. But we all know the close relationship between Iran and Russia. It goes way back. And certainly in the last couple of years during this conflict, Iran has been providing Shahed drones to the Russian side, which have turned out to be a very effective weapon system. And so I imagine in return, Russia has been providing technology, other resources to Iran that they need to help them with the development of their nuclear weapons program. And of course, geographically, Iran and Russia have been working together with a combination of railroads, rivers, Caspian Sea, to be able to bypass sanctions for Russia to get through the Caspian Sea to Iran, to the Indian Ocean, and to avoid sanctions. So they have been working together for quite some time. She is terrified. I'm going to hit this glass here. Thank you. So I think what we have seen over the last, or what we're seeing now, is a result of a relationship between Russia and Iran where they have the same interests. They want to cause as many problems for the West, especially for the United States, to create problems and disturbances that stress the relationship between all of us, between the allies of NATO, between the members of the European Union. If you go back to Russia's support for the Assad regime, which killed thousands of innocent Syrian people and put hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees on the road to Europe. This was not an accident. This was part of the Kremlin's desire to weaponize refugees, which has put enormous stress on the European Union, obviously here in Germany and in other countries. So all of these things, the continued problems in Kosovo, that this is not just an accident. This is Russia continuing to add to the pressure there, again, so it stresses the relationships between all of us, because they do know that the way that we defeat Russia, the way that we maintain stability and security in the world, is when the West sticks together. That doesn't mean we agree with each other on everything or that we like each other's policies all the time, but in terms of what really matters, our stability, our security, our prosperity, that depends on the combined strength of the populations, the economies, the societies, and the military of all the countries of the West, the philosophical West, countries that have liberal democratic governments and societies. That's what's at stake here. So all of these pressures that are happening make it very difficult for us to stick together. The fact that hundreds of thousands of people in many cities around the world, including in the U.S. and in Europe, took to the streets to support Palestine, when most of them have no idea who the Palestinians are, or could find a place called Palestine on the map because it doesn't exist. But yet hundreds of thousands of people went into the street because of, I think, disinformation. We know that this attack that supposedly destroyed a hospital and killed 400 people or 500 people inside Gaza, that was proven to be a false report, but it got around the world so fast that it created this wave of protests that is intended to put pressure on all of us, on our relationship. So I just want to put that out first as the framework for what we're doing. And of course, the Chinese are watching. The Chinese are wondering, do we, the West, and especially the United States, do we have the will and the capability to support Ukraine to defeat Russia? Do we have the capability to also, at the same time, have the ability to provide Israel what it needs to survive? And we all, at the same time, we can put pressure on Israel to conduct operations in accordance with the law of armed conflict and not to use excessive force against civilians. Do we have the capability to send a message to Iran that they cannot just attack their neighbors or Americans who are deployed in Iraq and Syria fighting against ISIS? And that China, do they see that we have the ability to do all of that at the same time and still have the ability to tell the Chinese, do not make a terrible miscalculation and think that now is your opportunity to seize Taiwan? And of course, the Chinese, they're testing us also. You know that the United States and the Philippines, we have a treaty obligation to help defend the Philippines. And recently, a Chinese ship rammed a ship of the Philippine Navy, a supply vessel that was out trying to bring supply to an area that the Philippines claims that China wants. So they rammed the ship. And then just about 4 days ago, a Chinese fighter aircraft flew within about 3 meters of a U.S. B-52 bomber that was in international airspace. So these are the kind of things that are going on out there. Thank goodness we have a president right now who is experienced, calm, intelligent, and has a team that has worked hard on preserving the relationships, rebuilding the relationships with all of our allies. That's what is at stake right now. So let's talk first about Israel. There is no doubt that the attack by Hamas should be condemned by every single person. There's no way you can justify what Hamas has done, the murder of hundreds of innocent people. That attack has to be condemned. No matter what, that attack has to be condemned. Israel absolutely has the right to defend itself as a sovereign nation. And the hundreds of people, the hostages that are still being held, should, of course, immediately be released and sent back to their families. I'm sure you all saw that this morning they found the body of the young German Israeli woman who was one of the first hostages. They found her body inside Gaza. It's a terrible situation. You think about the families that are worried. They want revenge, they want their child back, or they want their parent back, or they want their sibling back. And so it's a terrible situation. That has got to be resolved, and nations should be putting enormous pressure on Iran to put pressure on Hamas to release these hostages. I think Qatar is leading the effort right now to try to negotiate release of hostages. I imagine that the Hamas is not interested in just releasing everybody because they know how valuable hostages are. So I could envision a scenario where they might release 2 each week, or wait a couple of weeks and 2 more, and to put pressure on the Israeli government to stop the offensive, so that more hostages can be released. So this is underway. Having said all that, as terrible as Hamas is, and they're a terrorist organization. The EU classifies them as a terrorist organization. The U.S. does. There's no doubt they are the aggressor here. But why does Hamas exist? How do you defeat a terrorist organization? And that's the stated objective of the Netanyahu government, to destroy Hamas. I don't think it's possible to destroy Hamas. They're going to kill a lot of Hamas fighters. There's no doubt. They're going to destroy a lot of the infrastructure. But everything that the Israelis are going to destroy, capture, kill in the next weeks or months, every bit of it can be replaced. If Israel is not able to address the root cause of Hamas and is not able to isolate Hamas from external support, money, new troops, weapons, rockets, all that, if you can't do those 2 things, then you never will destroy Hamas. And I think that's why my president is putting pressure on the Israelis to, number one, do not use excessive force, but also we still advocate, U.S. policy is the 2-state solution, that there has to be a Palestinian state. Now, Israelis will understandably say, how can we be safe living next to a Palestinian state? Well, West Germany lived next to the Warsaw Pact for 40 years, even though Warsaw Pact had thousands of nuclear weapons. Taiwan lives next to China. I mean, this is not unusual. Israel is surrounded by countries that over the years have talked about its destruction. But I think in terms of a long-term, stable environment, the idea of a 2-state solution is one that has to be pursued. It cannot be any worse than what they have now. It can't be any more dangerous than what they're already dealing with. So I think a diplomatic outcome is going to be part of this, and I anticipate that the United States and others are going to put pressure on the Israelis to begin to start talking about what is the end state. What does this look like after the operation is finally brought to a conclusion? 360,000 Israeli reservists have been called up and are in uniform and are out in the field now, either part of the operation in Gaza or up in north of Israel to be prepared against a possible attack by Hezbollah. 360,000 people that would normally be in the workforce. I mean, this is almost 10% of the Israeli workforce. This is not something that you can sustain indefinitely, so there's an economic price to be paid in Israel as well. Of course, the Israelis have to worry about Hezbollah coming into the fight. Hassan Nasrallah, who is the leader of Hezbollah, he's scheduled to give a speech on Friday from Lebanon about the situation. I think all of us will be paying attention. What is our friend Hassan going to be saying? Of course, I expect he will come out. He'll condemn the Israelis. He'll say that the attack by Hamas was justified. The Palestinian people are being treated terribly. The continued illegal settlements inside the West Bank that the Israeli government allows, violence by settlers from these illegal settlements against Palestinians that live legally in the West Bank. All of these things will be played out. But I don't think he's going to be there at the podium and announce we're going to attack. If Hezbollah is going to attack, they're not going to announce it. It's going to happen. I'm not sure that they really want to do this. You know, the United States Navy now has 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the region, in the Mediterranean, and one is moving around to the other side of the Suez, so that they can send a very clear signal to Iran that we are prepared. Should Iran decide to do something to escalate, that we can help Israel or conflict punishment on Iranian oil fields, harbors. I don't know what the targets would be, but to send a message to the Iranians that do not make a terrible mistake and think you can escalate this without paying a price. And so I imagine that these kind of conversations are going on right now. For the Russians, of course, what they want is this continued distraction. And you're seeing the distraction played out in the U.S. Congress. Exactly as Jacob said, the U.S. House of Representatives finally selected its speaker, Mr. Johnson from Louisiana, who I have to admit I had never heard of before. I think even Senator McConnell said he had never heard of him before. But that's now his partner, his colleague. And so we'll see. I was not happy with the choice. Of course, the Congress has to move forward. So I think there were probably some of the 220 Republicans who voted for this guy were at the point of, we have to get things done. So perhaps that's why they were willing to accept it. I don't condone it. I'm trying to understand it. Now, 3 things about Mr. Johnson worry me a lot. Number one, he's an election denier. He was one of the leading advocates for Mr. Trump's effort to overturn the results of the election. That's not a good symbol when you have the Speaker of the House doesn't accept the previous election. Number 2, he is an absolute zealot when it comes to his extreme religious beliefs. I mean, almost like Taliban without cutting people's heads off. I think that that concerns me. Not that he's very religious, but that he puts it on all of us. I mean, when he said just a couple of days ago, somebody said, "What is your worldview? What guides your worldview?" He said, "Well, open up your Bible. That's what guides my worldview." That's not what I want to hear from the Speaker of the House, where our Constitution, the word God, is not mentioned. You know, in the Constitution, in fact, it's organized to make sure that we separate church and state, as all of you know that. So this is not a positive indicator. Now, a lot of people say things until they're in power, and then they have responsibility, and they have to do things differently to govern. So I am obviously hopeful that he will be more responsible than what he said before. But the third thing that worries me about him, of course, he does not have a good record on support for Ukraine. In fact, he's already said, I think it was on one of the Sunday morning TV shows, where he said that he was going to separate the next aid package for Ukraine from the aid package for Israel. You know, the president recently said he wanted all these together: Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and American border security, all in one package. The Republicans immediately said, no way, these need to be separated. Israel is more urgent, Ukraine not so much. So we'll see how this plays out over the next few weeks. But I am worried. I'm worried that even though a majority of the Congress supports Ukraine, the majority of the American people support Ukraine, the leadership on the Republican side of the House, which is important because the Speaker is who decides what comes to the floor for votes. This is a challenge. Now, President Biden has been doing this kind of thing for about 50 years. So he has some experience, and I think he will figure out a way to get done what needs to be done. But it's going to be painful, and of course, it is an election year. Let me come back to Gaza. I want to mention just a couple of things before we talk specifically about Russia and the U.S. election. Like all of you, I've been watching the news the last 3 weeks, and almost every day what you hear is it started yet? Is the Israeli ground offensive started? Like the kickoff for a big football game. And it's not going to happen like that. In fact, what is happening, what the Israelis are doing, I believe, just based on watching, they're not going to do a large scale, like everybody goes into Gaza at the same time. Number one, it would be a lot more casualties for themselves. Number two, it would cause a lot more damage to the Palestinian population there, and it would play right into the hands of what Hamas wants, is a very destructive assault. It kills lots of innocent people, even more than are already being killed, and I think it would be a trap for the Israelis. So instead, what they are doing is, it looks to me, they're probing in with reconnaissance forces, finding spaces where they can then set up a strong point and then move to the next one. And so piecemeal, gradually destroy Hamas strong points and build up Israeli combat power inside probably the northern half of Gaza. I don't see it as feasible that they will try to clear all of Gaza, but at least probably the northern half. That's what it looks like they're doing. Of course, there are airstrikes. Of course, there's artillery. Of course, there are civilian casualties. We would be naive to think that the Israelis will prevent civilian casualties. I don't believe any number that comes from Hamas, but there's no doubt that there are thousands of innocent people are going to be killed in this process. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I am confident that I understand the law of armed conflict, and that even though Hamas is using innocent Palestinians as a shield, I mean, it's pretty well known that Hamas headquarters is located under the main hospital in Gaza. These are all violations of law of armed conflict, but none of us are surprised that Hamas is doing this. That does not relieve Israel of the burden, the legal burden, to protect civilians. So even though Hamas is shooting rockets from inside a neighborhood, Israel is not therefore free just to shoot back. So there's going to be a constant tension until this is over, as they try to measure what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, how much pressure are they willing to take from the U.S., from the West, from the world about this. So I think we're going to be watching this play out like this over the next many weeks. I don't know how long it lasts. I would expect many weeks before the Israelis decide, okay, we've done enough, we've destroyed enough, and for whatever reason, we're going to stop here for a while. I don't think that they want to get back into occupation of Gaza. You remember they left Gaza 5 years ago because you suffer casualties, it's expensive, and there's nothing good that comes from it. So I guess if I was to criticize the Israelis, it would be, what is the end state? What are you trying to achieve beyond just to kill as many Hamas fighters as possible? The long-term end state. And that's the job of the president or the prime minister. I'm not sure that Prime Minister Netanyahu will be around much longer, especially once this, at some point. I mean, there are a lot of calls for him to resign right now because of this humiliating embarrassment of Israeli defense forces and Israeli security. I mean, the perception of Israel as being unbeatable. To be called by surprise as they were, this is a huge shock to their psyche, to the population. And of course, I've always believed that the first principle of leadership is that you accept responsibility. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, a couple of days ago, he blamed his security services. They didn't tell me that Hamas was going to do this. I mean, it's terrible. Then he deleted the tweet But that was his first response, was to blame his security service. Now, for sure, they failed miserably. I think for a variety of reasons. We'll learn more after the investigations are done, but probably a combination of over-reliance on technology. But if you think of all the big embarrassments or mistakes the U.S. has made, where we were caught by surprise, Pearl Harbor, the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the Tet offensive by the Viet Cong in Vietnam, and then, of course, 9/11. And all four of these, when you look back, there were warnings and indicators that were ignored. And now they look so obvious when you look back. They're not so obvious when it's happening. So why is that? And I think there's something called confirmation bias, where you already think you know, and so you see things, you look for what confirms what you believe. And it's a little bit more difficult that what you're seeing is like, oh my gosh, that's different from what we thought. Because now you lose confidence in all your systems, and it also forces you to have to do something about it. That's tough for elected officials. Like everybody in this room, I'm sure you can't believe that your son or daughter would ever do something bad. There's no way. Even though the evidence is right there, you found the marijuana in their room, or, the police call up. My parents had to come pick me up twice at the police station. My father was not so surprised. My mother was horrified, of course, but it was not for anything terrible, but it was embarrassing. One time may have involved alcohol, but and when I was 15, but that's the rumor. The point is, nations can be surprised because of gaps. What do we do with the information? And sometimes it's terribly inconvenient. And you have gaps in your processes, and I think that's part of where we are in the case of Israel. The last part I'd mentioned I'll address, and then I want to turn back to your questions. Jakob asked me to describe the world, and you have 30 minutes. So I could be more selective probably, but anyway, look, I absolutely believe that Ukraine is going to win this war. They have to. They're not going to stop. I mean, you see what happens. Any village, town that's occupied by the Russians, you see what happens. I mean, there was another family in occupied Luhansk, 9 people executed in their home by Chechens, part of the Russian forces, wanted that house. The family refused, so they killed everybody. And so you can see the pictures online as children. This is who we're dealing with. And so the Ukrainians know that's what happens. They know they'll never be safe or secure as long as Russia occupies Crimea. And so this counteroffensive is all about liberating Crimea. The counteroffensive is a multi-domain operation. That's what NATO calls it. That's what the German Bundeswehr does. That's what the U.S. military does. Multi-domain, air, land, sea, cyber, space. And you integrate these things to achieve the outcome that you're trying to get. So what we see and hear as the counteroffensive that's moving too slow, that's only the land part, where they're in the trenches and minefields, and they're continuing to make progress, just not at the speed that we had all hoped. At the same time, where's the Black Sea Fleet? And they're leaving. They're leaving Crimea because the Ukrainians have used drones, special forces, destroyed Russian radar. They've used the Storm Shadow provided by the UK, and they have used maritime drones to destroy Russian radar on the west side of the Crimean Peninsula, destroy a maintenance site, the dry dock, which is essential. If the Russian Navy is going to operate from Sevastopol, they have to have a dry dock for maintenance. It's gone. It was gone. And also the submarine and logistics ship that were in the dry dock. That was the bonus. And then the next thing was, of course, destruction of the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. And there were some reports like, oh, maybe they killed the admiral. I promise you, that does not matter. Admirals and generals can be easily replaced. Much more difficult to replace the 30 staff officers that were killed or wounded in that headquarters. And so now the Black Sea Fleet is in the process of relocating further to the east. So that proves the concept that Ukraine can make Crimea untenable if they have what they need, which is long-range precision weapons. There was a report yesterday that the first time ATACMS, the American ATACMS, were used against Russian forces in Crimea. I think it was an air defense site that they hit. But my president has got to say, and your Bundeskanzler has to say, we want Ukraine to win. And if they do that, then we provide what's needed. That means the longer range capabilities like the German Taurus. And then I will be even more confident that Ukraine is going to win. This is not going to stop in the wintertime. In the 18th century, we all depended on horses to pull cannons. And so they could only operate when you had grass for the horses. But we don't need horses anymore. So they're going to keep the pressure on the Russians throughout the winter, I believe. Okay, I will look forward to challenges and questions and help me get this right. And I can hear some people's stomachs growling also. You're ready for lunch, but I look forward to questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And